So I'll begin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Jim Haggerty. I'm president of PRCG Haggerty and also Reputation Advisors International, which is a network of senior crisis communicators and reputation counselors around the world. I want to invite you to our webinar, Crisis Communications Lessons from the First Trump Administration, and I want to thank you all for attending. We're excited today because we had a great group of registrants, not just from the United States, but from around the world. We have an excellent panel, and the topic seems to have only become more relevant since we first announced that we were doing this webinar in December, given all the recent public attention on what is now Truth Social as the preferred platform for communication with the president-elect. Unfortunately, one of our panelists had to drop out. Catherine Fung, a senior reporter from Newsweek, was going to join us to give her um, context from as someone in the media who has to deal with this stuff every day and has to deal with information from us every day. Unfortunately, and this is a little bit ironic, she's also covering President Trump's sentencing in a New York courtroom. And while it looked up to last night as if that would be postponed, we learned late last night that she has to be there. And so she can't make it, but she provided us with some notes and excellent discussions in advance of this, and we're going to weave that into the presentation this morning. We have a lot to cover in the space of an hour, and so we're going to move quickly. And I'll introduce our panelists and give a few opening remarks, and then Tom and Eric will get right into it. We're aiming to leave plenty of time at the end of this session for Q&As. And the way we're going to handle it is there's a Q&A box on your screen in the menu bar. If you could write your questions in there, we'll get to as many as we can. Also, we're recording the webinar this morning, and all of the examples we mentioned in the course of this hour will be available on the Reputation Advisors International website later today. We'll email each registrant a link to a page with all the web links and background information on the various topics and points we're going to go through, so you don't have to take copious notes, and you won't be tested at the end. So let me introduce our two esteemed panelists today. Tom Weidlich is a managing director of PRCG Haggerty with a long career, not just in crisis communications and reputation management, but also as a journalist, having worked at Bloomberg News and the National Law Journal, among others, over the years. Eric Rhodes is a partner at EK PR in Los Angeles, one of the largest public affairs firms in Southern California, and he has decades of experience in crisis communications response. I want to especially thank Eric for being here today, given the crisis, the tragic crisis in Southern California. And, Eric, our thoughts are with everyone out there on the West Coast. But thank you for joining us, even in the midst of all that. Also joining us today is Lucy O'Brien, a director here at PRCG. She's a skilled communications counselor in her own right, but also a logistical genius, and she's helping us through all of the setup for the program today, including the questions that will come through, which, again, we want to leave a sufficient amount of time to get to at the end. Now, before I begin with Tom and Eric, I want to start off with a few points. First, I want to reemphasize, and this was as in the sign-up materials, that this is a nonpartisan, non-political event. We're not talking politics here per se. I know it's hard to make anything non-political in the world we live in today, but that's what we're doing here. This is not about should the president-elect be posting on social media. Should he be saying this? Should she be saying this in response? What does one party think? What does the other party think? We're not dealing with should. I always tell clients that I don't live in the world of should, I live in the world of is. And the fact of the matter is, this is the world in which we live today. And it's Democrats, Republicans, independents. We live in a world of criticism and attack. And this is not to place any judgment on that whatsoever. It's to talk about the effective way of handling those things when that happens. Which brings me to my next point, and I think this is an important one. You hear a lot of cliches when people decide to respond publicly to things. You hear, the best response is no comment. And then you hear, never say no comment. And sometimes you hear, we'll fight this in the courtroom where it really matters. And the one you hear a lot of is, it's different this time. You heard it, and I'm old enough to remember, the dot-com boom, and you heard it during the dot-com boom, and you heard it during the housing crisis and the financial crisis. You even heard it during the COVID response. It's different this time. Yes, the Trump 2.0 is different this time. Very much so. It's a different world that we live in than the world that we were in 2016. But just because there are differences doesn't mean the foundational elements of effective crisis communications response aren't still there, because they are. And I think that it's important to understand our history. There's all talk about cliches. There's all sorts of sayings, right? History doesn't repeat itself, it echoes. Those who don't pay attention to history are doomed to repeat it, et cetera, et cetera. I happen to believe that second one, that an understanding of what went on during the first Trump administration is a useful guide to what to expect and how things should be handled during the second Trump administration. And as Catherine Fung from Newsweek, who couldn't be here, said to us as we were discussing all this, there's a template out there that you can look at as you consider the ways to effectively respond. And that's the type of thing we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through various topics, Tom and Eric, and each one, and again, all of these topics will be in the background material, which we emailed to you. And for each one, we're going to have examples from the first Trump administration that give a sense for how things were handled. Eric and I discussed this earlier. There's always a question, what worked and what didn't, which is a bit of a subjective call. But certainly we can present how it was handled and what the ramifications were, and let you all decide on that. And my final point I will make, because we've had a very interesting time period since the election, as the new administration, the honeymoon period that you see before every new administration. And I want to leave you one last thought, based upon, I started out in politics and I've been doing crisis communications and reputational matters for more than 30 years now. And I can tell you one thing definitively: everyone overplays their hand, particularly in politics. Virtually every administration, no matter how much they won by, goes in thinking or saying they have some sort of mandate. So it's important to understand that as you go through this, that eventually this administration, which is riding high now, but we're in the pregame period, the show hasn't begun yet. Eventually, the administration, which is riding high, will likely make mistakes, piss people off, and then you'll see the pendulum begin to swing in the other direction. What does that mean for organizations? It means you can't be rushing to the latest shiny object or shifting in the political winds when you're composing a response during a sensitive communications situation. You really need to have a foundational sense of your organization, who you are, what you believe in, what you stand for, because in the short term, shifting with the political winds may help you. But I think history has shown, and it's our belief, that over the long term, moving back and forth like that will just cause trouble. And then the final point is, you won't hear a whole lot of, there's been a lot of talk as well about, Blake Lively and Hollywood PR and celebrity PR and spin doctoring and smearing. I can tell you definitively, and everyone on this panel agrees, I believe, that this is about fact and about truth. And it's about speaking in a manner that takes the facts and the truth and presents it in a way that responds to a sensitive situation. In this case, specifically something that happens during the next administration that puts you on the front burner from a crisis communication standpoint. It is not about spin. It is not about misleading. It's not about fighting back through chatbots and all sorts of other things that people love to read about because maybe they're on some level sexy. It is about facts and truth. And I think that, as you'll see from our examples, governs the responses that we've seen throughout the first Trump administration. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my esteemed colleague, Tom Weidlich, to begin talking about the various topics And then he and Eric are going to go back and forth, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So let me start by saying typically in a crisis, we talk about the three phases, what to do before, during, and after the crisis. The after is mostly about evaluating how you did and seeing what you need to change and, what worked and what didn't. Today, we're going to talk about the before and during, but we're going to flip it and talk about the during first because, A, that's really the focus of the talk. How did people respond during a crisis that involved being attacked, at least on Twitter, by the President of the United States? And we're going to go through, some approaches that they took and have examples for them. But, if you think about it, that also involves thinking about how you would plan for this, because, you'd think, what would be the proper response given the business that your company is in and the culture of your company? So these are various approaches that you can think about. And then after we do that, we're going to talk a little heavier about, some things to think about before and preparing for a potential attack. But in terms of approaches companies took during Trump's first term, well, number one is a crisis mainstay, which is arguing the facts, right? Often when you're attacked, you feel that your opponent has the facts wrong, and you have to get the truth out there. And that's actually more difficult than it sounds. It can be complicated. Our example there is Goodyear in 2020. Trump called for a boycott of Goodyear after it came out that it wouldn't let its employees wear Trump gear. And then this was sort of like a double lead story because it also came out they wouldn't let them wear Blue Lives Matter gear, apparently, but were encouraged to wear Black Lives Matter gear. So basically, Goodyear came out and said, well, on the first part, we encourage our workers not to wear any gear of a particular candidate, in terms of partisan politics. On the second part, there was a presentation. It was not sanctioned. It was not an HQ where somebody did a slide deck and actually did say that about Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. But it wasn't really, a statement from the company itself. And in these examples, by the way, we're going to try to give you just a little flavor of what the statement was. So in this case, for Goodyear, it was part of their statement said, Goodyear has always wholeheartedly supported equality in law enforcement and will continue to do so. These are not mutually exclusive. So that's the one on sticking to the facts. And Eric, over to you.
Yeah, another example of what other companies have done is to kind of address the issue, but not attack Trump. Again, going back to what worked in the previous administration. Everyone may recall what NFL teams faced in 2017 when the president attacked players for taking a knee during protests. Every single team issued a statement in regards to this issue, but not a single team mentioned Trump. For example, the Carolina Panthers owner, Jerry Richardson, issued a really good statement. And I think the first two sentences of his statement are worth repeating here. He said, we're proud of the men we have on this football team. Our players have been active and impactful participants in strengthening our community. And I think the league did something else. The league emphasized the league's support of the players' right to express their views, while also promoting unity and respect. I think all the other owners really framed their response as support of free expression rather than political statements. What everyone did was they reframed the debate. They didn't take on the president himself, but they also didn't shy away from the issue. And I think that's the way in which they were successful in managing a very hot potato in 2017. They didn't shy away from it, but they also didn't take on the president directly. Tom?
So another approach is to communicate that what Trump is attacking is actually just a business decision and sort of saying, stay in your lane. We know what we're doing. And an example here was when in 2017, and many people will remember this, when Trump attacked Nordstrom because it was dropping his daughter Ivanka's clothing line. And, and Nordstrom's main attack here was to say, look, this is a business decision. And the quote from the statement is, over the past year, and particularly in the last half of 2016, sales of the brand have steadily declined to the point where it didn't make good business sense for us to continue with the line for now. So again, I think people will, receive an approach like that as like, well, it's a company and they're making a business decision. And another example of this was in 2018 when Trump criticized GM. And if, Trump criticized GM a lot during this first term. He criticized the company because they threatened to pull subsidies because they said they were going to close 5 plants. And GM defended its record by saying that it would, closing the plants would strengthen its ability to thrive, and also sort of, in a way, sticking to the facts, said many workers would get jobs in other plants, so they weren't actually, laying off a lot of people. And the quote from GM there was, yesterday's announcements support our ability to invest for future growth and position the company for long-term success and maintain and grow American jobs. So both sort of communicating it's a business decision and sticking to the facts. Eric?
Yeah, and back to the NFL seems to be something I looked at quite closely for this webinar. Sometimes the NFL decided to become a little more aggressive with the president. As everyone will recall, the president seemed to have an affinity toward attacking the NFL in 2017 when players were taking knees in protest. He was quite vocal about his displeasure. Roger Goodell said, quote, divisive comments like these demonstrate an unfortunate lack of respect for the NFL. The NFL then initiated work with players on community outreach programs to address social concerns. They demonstrated commitment to actionable change beyond symbolic gestures. So they actually upped the ante with the president to really take him on, because I think that's what the players and the players union wanted to do. But the league largely avoided escalating the situation further, aiming to present a united front and to try to de-escalate the tension. The league had a kind of a fine line to walk. They had a players and a players union who wanted them to unite around what the players wanted. At the same time, they wanted to avoid a further battle with the president. Tom?
So you can see here we have a few points that are really focused on, sticking to what you do for a living and defending yourself in terms of that. And so sort of related to these previous couple of points is highlighting your company's contribution to the economy and job creation. And I think, that could be on the local level, but it would especially be helpful if it's on the national level. And again, continuing with the General Motors in the same situation where they were criticized for the factory closings, they also said GM is committed to maintaining a strong manufacturing presence in the U.S., as evidenced by our more than 22 billion investments in U.S. operations since 2009. We don't specifically have a point in this, but it occurs to me that it's always good to use numbers. When you're invoking facts, invoking numbers is also helpful, as GM did.
Can I jump in with just one point, and I want you to
Sure.
respond to it
Yeah, of course.
before we go on. There is a natural tendency to want to, and again, this is whoever it is, Trump, Elon Musk, AOC, across the political spectrum, to want to outdo them in the snark department.
Yeah.
That's not what we saw among the responses we thought were effective first time around. So talk about because you get all revved up, and you're seeing this now, interestingly, with Canada and Mexico in their responses to Trump. But tell me about why, as a general crisis communications plan, that is probably less effective in most cases, or is it?
I mean, I think it's sort of, a rise above situation, not to lower yourself to that snark. What do you think, Eric?
I would agree with you. I completely agree with you.
But not to
Yeah,
get ahead of ourselves, we
Yeah.
do have an example of something that was a little snarky.
for every rule there is an exception, right?
That's right.
Exactly. But I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh,
I
all
just
right,
had Eric, you're up.
you're
Well,
up.
and I think some areas, sometimes companies have to reinforce their core values. An example of this would be Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola's response to the president's discussion of the 2017 Muslim travel ban is a strong example of kind of corporate messaging aligning with their core values. Coca-Cola reinforced its commitment to diversity, fairness, and inclusion by explicitly condemning the president's comments on the travel ban. And I think in this case for Coca-Cola, the statements redefine the company's stance on their social and political issues, but it also defined their brand identity among their shareholders. Their approach for Coca-Cola demonstrated their value-driven messaging. It was unique for their company and their principles in how they address a controversial topic, similar to how the NFL addressed the knee-taking controversies. Again, it's value-driven for their company and their organization. So if you have a core value as an organization, you have to stick to it. And I think we'll get to that in a moment relative to how you market to your organization. You have to be true to who you are, and you can embrace it and come out ahead. And I have an example of that in a moment.
Another approach we saw, but frankly, not a lot of, but we did see some, is to balance criticism with praise. I mean, you'll see statements where they'll specifically criticize Trump for the issue at hand, but find some way to also praise him. And an example of that, again, from the Muslim travel ban, which, if you remember, was really a huge deal right at the beginning of the term, and a lot of companies really felt the need to come out with statements. And my example here of balancing the criticism with praise sort of ironically comes from Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, because he's so in the news about kind of sucking up to Trump before the new administration starts, in terms of, he announced they're not going to be doing the fact checking anymore and things like that. But in terms of the Muslim ban, I'm going to give you two quotes from Zuckerberg's. He actually did, a Facebook post on this, kind of long one, but he wrote, "Like many of you, I'm concerned about the impact of the recent executive orders signed by President Trump," meaning the Muslim ban. But he also said, "I was glad to hear President Trump say he's going to work something out for dreamers, immigrants who were brought to this country at a young age by their parents." So, when you're crafting statements, I would say, think about, is that approach you want to take, that to be sure to also praise him. I mean, that's something that he's done. That's something to give some thought to.
And I don't mean to keep in, I'm gonna ask another question about that, because Tom, do you think that we've seen in the past, since the election, a whole heaping of praise, and that might be the new go-to strategy in the way that it wasn't the first time around?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense of that, so, but maybe that's to be expected, because people are trying to get in good with the administration.
Yeah, okay.
The other thing that, and again, there's also embrace his attacks and use it as marketing, Tom. And we started to talk about that. Know who you are as a brand. Vanity Fair, I thought, did that very effective in 2016 when Trump lashed out at the magazine for their scathing review, if you recall, the Trump Grill Tower in New York. The magazine just owned it. They went big. They had a Vanity Fair said they did an ad, subscribe today. They ran an ad calling itself the magazine Trump doesn't want you to read. They did full page ads, and subscriptions went up 100%. They tweeted about it. They just owned the fact that they were the magazine that Trump didn't like. So sometimes understanding who you are, and where you fit in the Trump universe can be good for your brand. So again, knowing where you are as an organization is helpful to be true to where you are. So again, we're showing, we're not telling you what to do, but to understand who you are and where you are as an organization in a crisis.
But that's the one that I was saying involved a little snark, so Vanity Fair was a little snarky there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, our last 2 points on this, and they're sort of contradict each
That's
other.
right.
Um, and this one is not really about crafting the messaging so much, but what you actually do, and it is to accommodate him. And we're kind of seeing some of that now. We may see more of that, I would think, especially at the beginning of the term. But our example in terms of that was that even before he was in office for the first term in early January 2017, he attacked Ford for its plan to build a plant in Mexico, a $1.6 billion plant. And in response to that, I mean, basically, people agree it was in response to Trump's criticism. It's hard to say 100%, but they scrapped the plan and it said they would instead expand the factory in Michigan to make hybrid pickup trucks and electric SUVs. So, I mean, during a conference call, the CEO, Mark Field, said that it was based on the tax cuts and regulatory proposals supported by Trump. Um, I mean, some of the reporting did say it was really in response to the criticism, but the statement itself didn't mention Trump or his criticism. And again, that's an example of maybe sometimes in a statement you can address the issue, but not necessarily name Trump. Okay, Eric, last one.
Yeah, and some companies have chosen to ignore him, and it has worked as an effective strategy. Silence can sometimes be an effective strategy. Amazon did that in 2018 when he accused them of pulling a scam on the United States Postal Service. Jeff Bezos largely remained silent when he criticized Amazon for their effective relationship with the United States Postal Service, and saying it was costing the United States Postal Service hundreds of millions of dollars by his very um, uh, favorable terms that he had with the Postal Service. General Motors largely ignored him when, in a 2019 New York Times article. What many companies learn is that the president has a short attention span and he'll move on to another issue. Mexico largely has done that. We've seen this now with his talking about renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of California. The president of Mexico has joked about renaming it the Gulf of renaming some portions of California um, Mexico, but has largely ignored what he has said and shunned some reporters' questions. So even other politicians have taken to the idea that if you ignore him and don't feed him and feed his ego, that he'll move on to the next thing that comes up. So he'll focus more on Greenland or Canada or whatever he's focused on for the day. So there is a strategy in crisis communications to ignore him. And it has proven, as we've seen from his previous administration, to be an effective strategy.
So, Jim, should we move on to the beginning, so to speak, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to talk now about, and there are some questions on this, and I'll have some questions on the end. We're going to talk now about, okay, there's the cafeteria menu of ways you might respond. How do you plan and how do you put the proper procedures in place to respond? One of the things that Catherine Fung at Newsweek said to me was, speed is the most important part of this, because the sooner, if you're going to respond, the sooner you respond, the more it's up on the top of the article instead of just appended to the bottom of it. And that tends to diffuse negative situations sometimes. So Tom and Eric, why don't you talk about what you do before the crisis, and then we'll start thinking about questions.
Yeah, so it's planning is obviously a big part, having a crisis plan and thinking about scenarios where you could be attacked. Well, here's, the scenario is being attacked by the president of the United States, at least in a tweet or some other kind of social media. Um, and getting more specifically into that, how or where you would be attacked. So we're big believers in that concept we call the credibility bank. That a good way that to fight a crisis, or what's going to help you in a crisis, is if you already have a good reputation, including having good relationships with people. So here, and we're seeing a lot of this, one tack is to try to develop a relationship with either Trump himself or high level people in the administration. I mean, the example from the last time was really Apple and Tim Cook. I mean, and there were a number of articles at the time, if you recall, written about, his strategy in terms of, getting close to the administration. I mean, it helps to be a Magnificent Seven company to do that. But you'll recall, I mean, and it was effective too, because in 2019, when Trump, proposed his China tariffs back then, Cook is credited with getting exemptions for electronics like the iPhone. So, and another approach in terms of the credibility bank is can you align your priorities with the administration's priorities, or some of their priorities, but at the same time, this is really, I mean, this is almost, obviously in a sense lobbying, but so there's always a danger of getting burned in that. So, you have to be extremely cautious. I was going to mention one other thing. I don't know, Jim, if you were going to mention this, something that Catherine said, but I thought it was really interesting, and it works in terms of planning, which is that she feels a lot of journalists and media outlets are going to be looking to see how companies respond differently from the first term. I hadn't really thought about that there's going to be, what's different in the way that maybe specific companies or companies in general respond. So that's something to think about too in planning. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
would just add to that's a really important point. Who's flip-flopping becomes a story in itself.
right,
And
right.
that just fuels the fire of not just, and by the way, it's not just President Trump. I mean, another thing that you have to be aware of is there's a whole other group of actors surrounding him now that didn't really exist the first time around, who will also, I mean, Elon Musk is obviously the primary example, who will also be out there giving their opinions on various topics. But
Right.
one of the things the media will be looking at, and even social media, because it drives an increase of reposts and other sorts of things, is the flip-flop. And if you don't have, like, for example, Vanity Fair, Eric, I
Yep.
assume Vanity Fair will not be sitting down with Trump anytime soon, or appointing Vince McMahon to its board of directors. That would probably be against their brand, and a bit of a flip-flop, and that would
Right.
generate its own series of stories. So all those things are important to remember.
Right. But I also think if you're a company now and you're thinking ahead from a good crisis management perspective, it's not hard to do some planning. You got to think about what industries he attacked previously. Early on, he criticized Carrier for moving jobs to Mexico. Boeing for the Air Force One planes. Ironically, he's not going to have his own Air Force One planes that he negotiated in his administration. It doesn't look like drug companies for pricing, the jets for F-35s, media companies. If you're a government contractor, you should be looking at prices. If you're a manufacturer with plants outside the U.S., you ought to be thinking about how you bring some of that manufacturing back into the U.S., drug makers for cost and the price of your goods. So some of this stuff is just very obvious. Look at what he has said during the campaign, what his rhetoric is, and you can think about where you're likely to be attacked and what you need to be thinking about for your response. It really, and I know this is a overused term, it's not rocket science. He's very predictable about where his attacks are going to be. He uses the same attacks over and over again. And the difference this time, I think, from his previous administration, is he has amplification. And what I mean by that is before he had Twitter and the Truth Social a little bit. Now he has Elon Musk and additional people to amplify his message. And so when he does something, he has this additional people, groups to amplify his message. And we saw this with the recent fight where he can mobilize other groups and organizations to attack a group or organization through social media. And so that's, I think, the new worry for organization companies or individuals.
I mean, and really related to that too, is you kind of think about how he would go after your company, what activity you're engaged in. And again, so not just looking at the companies he attacked, but what the activities were. And there really were themes, that relate to, his main concerns. So, for example, if you were going to do a layoff, look, like a layoff is a crisis.
Sure.
Now the added measure is, okay, in your crisis plan for the layoffs, how will we respond if we're attacked by the president of the United States for laying off workers? Similarly, moving factories outside the US might get his attention. If you have government contracts, obviously he has a lot to say about that. But outside that area, he's criticized, he's not Bernie Sanders, but he's criticized pharmaceutical companies for raising drug prices. So if you're in that area, and then also any involvement with his family, of course, which the Nordstrom example shows us. And then just also kind of obviously, if you have if you're publicly disagreeing with his policies, you should have baked into that how you would respond to that attack.
Right. And I think, again, as part of good crisis management, you ought to be thinking ahead how you're going to respond to the administration's substantive policies. And if so, which one? For example, a Muslim ban. Are you going to comment on Doge activities? How will they affect your company? So there are things you should be thinking about now and planning ahead uh, relative to comments or engagement from really a practical planning crisis communications. Because if you're a company doing business with the government or impacted by any of his policies, the likelihood that he could say or do something that impacts your company is high. And the time to be thinking about it is now, not in the moment.
So, and the final point is, obviously there's some tension in what we're saying between, this time it's different and, the danger of fighting the last battle. I've been thinking about this a lot that, how will it be different and how will it be similar in the first term? And it's really hard to say. I mean, I just don't know, but there are certain things that are probably pretty apparent that given the backlash against DEI, that, so an extra, if you have DEI activities, you should be prepared for a backlash to begin with, because that's what's going on. But that backlash might come from the president of the United States. I just don't know. I mean, I think it makes sense to think how the different approaches he might take. The other thing that's different about this time is he's obviously, we had this incredible trend of defamation lawsuits, and he is involved in that. I mean, we recently had ABC recently settled with him, and then he went ahead and sued the Des Moines Register for something that its pollster said during the election. So you might have to, in addition to preparing for crisis communications, you might have to prepare for litigation communications.
That is true.
Yeah. And I want to, before we get to some questions, I want to ask a specific question about the need for speed and the need to plan this. There is, it's an important element of what we preach, right? Is the ability, and I know I've been in, I often think that when you see in a news story, company X could not be reached for comment, it usually means company X could not get its act together quickly enough to comment.
That's right.
And that's because we begin to create the crisis plan after the crisis occurs. And I thought, if each of you could talk about, and this goes to the second part of your presentation, having the plumbing in place so that things work when you need to move quickly. And I'll start with Tom.
I mean, speed is really, really important. Yeah, like why does it take a company a day to get a statement together that says we will fight this lawsuit vigorously? Um, but at the same time, the rub is that you need to be accurate, in what you're saying. Like the worst thing is to put out a statement that you then have to correct. And the answer is, people want to see you saying something. So I think the answer is to first get, like this is just crisis in general, is to, get a statement out saying that you're aware of the situation and you're looking into it, and you will provide an update when you have the right information. Waiting too long is wrong, and putting out a statement with the wrong facts is wrong.
Eric,
Yeah,
to add to
I don't
that?
disagree. I don't disagree with anything Tom said, but I also think that having no comments a PR felony. It just looks guilty. And I've always said to clients, everyone knows their weaknesses. Every company knows where they're vulnerable. Everyone knows what they're afraid, what keeps them up at night. Every top executive knows what question they're afraid to be asked because they just do. And so one of the exercises that I like to run with my clients is tell me all the things that worry you the most. And we do this a lot with clients. What's the scenario that what is the question you don't want to be asked? Let's ask it now. Let's come up with the framework for answers. Let's get it vetted by legal. Let's have it hold in a vault. So when you get that question asked by a reporter or it comes up, that we can act with speed so that we can get it out quickly. And when it happens, people thank me because they say, okay, they breathe a sigh because they didn't have to worry. And then they don't look guilty. They don't have that no comment. And the same holds true here. If you think you're vulnerable to an attack from the president or from the administration, um, let's think through this scenario. Let's think through what that might be. Let's come up with a holding statement. It doesn't have to be long because we know that reporters don't like to write long answers. And let's work through that now and have it prepared. It's very simple. To
Right,
your point, Jim, at the beginning, this isn't rocket science.
right, right. And I think that I'm the only lawyer on the panel, and I will tell you the problem with response is if you don't have the template in place for various scenarios, there's a couple problems. But one is lawyers, by and large, and I pick on lawyers because I am one, will always begin the conversation with say nothing or say as little as possible, or this is just our time, keep your head down. And if you have all agreed beforehand as to a strategy, and are committed to it as an organization, then it's that much easier. And I wanted to go to a question we
But
see
I will
from the
say
audience.
one thing, and I don't
Yeah,
want to go against what I said. Sometimes, and very few times, saying nothing in this case works. And we gave some examples
yeah,
where not engaging works. Not always.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, if you go too far, if Canada goes too far with a detailed response
Right.
as to let's explain why we don't want to be part of the United States,
Right.
now you've created another couple days of stories as each of those points gets picked at from left, right, and every other direction.
Right. Exactly.
I do want to get to a question that we received, and it's as follows: considering the arbitrariness of who gets attacked, and we've discussed some of this already, um, what's the guidance for individuals or organizations in responding to either a flash or sustained social media or other comms attack that may be stoked by the president, may be stoked by supporters, or may just explode? Because again, this is about the world we live in. It's not just about the current occupant of the White House. So why don't you start and then I'll jump in. I mean, some of it's what we've talked about in terms of speed and being ready beforehand, but go ahead.
Right. Well, I
I
think
mean,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Tom.
Okay,
No, Tom,
Eric.
go ahead.
I mean, arbitrariness is a good word, but
Yeah.
that's what we're trying to avoid. I guess we're saying like, how arbitrary is it really? We're trying to
Yeah,
identify, I mean, you could identify again, what are the most likely areas where you might be attacked. And given any announcement that you're going to make, I mean, maybe you have to think, will the president of the United States have something to say about this? But then I think in general, you could have, a policy, call it a crisis plan, for how you would respond in general to attack from him. So to be ready for that. I mean, it gets us down to some nitty gritty stuff like, who has to approve the statement, you know,
yeah, yeah.
and
Right.
that
And
kind
what
of.
you have to do, and also knowing what your values are beforehand. I mean, no one is explicitly, and I'll go on a limb here, against diversity. I think that there is a way to talk about the importance of your workforce being a certain way, but also you want the best quality workforce. There's also, you get into these visa issues and it gets very nitty gritty, but it should all flow from what you really believe about an organization. And the other thing I will point out in the arbitrariness, I mean, well, two other things. One is if the president stops at a McDonald's in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, and didn't like the service and posts about it, you have to be able to differentiate what is important and what isn't in terms of the long-term success of your organization. And that gets to the point of what don't you respond to? I think
Right.
that's critically important. And I think that an important premise for all crisis communications is as follows. We are minimizing a negative situation. Every organization has crises and issues and negative situations. And the question is, will the response up the temperature or will it lower the temperature? There's a great quote in the movie, the George Clooney movie, Michael Clayton, where he says, I'm not a miracle worker, I'm a janitor. The smaller the mess, the easier it is to clean up. And if you are understanding that we are going to minimize, we're not going to turn this into a positive, although there have been examples
That's
through
right.
CNS where it has happened. But we're going to minimize the damage from those menu items, really thinking about them and understanding which one is going to work in a different situation.
Right.
And so another question, and I think this is important, um, how do you establish your value? This is a broader question. How do you establish your values beforehand so that you're not, again, trying to figure out what the values of a company, what the values are of a company or organization after we used to call them tweets, right? Now, what are they called? X's? I don't even know. After there is a post, how do you establish those values beforehand, and how do you understand the world in which you live as well?
Well, I mean, I think, a lot of it, frankly, in most organizations stems from the values of the people at the top. but also, I mean, I think just, answering the question of whether you engage in partisan politics goes a long way. And if you have, if you have a value statement for the company, that's a template for maybe how you would approach this.
And by the way, as an aside, there are a lot of companies out there right now that are scrubbing their
Right,
company websites of
right,
any sort of statement of values or
right.
anything that they think might offend in this new political climate. But remember my original statement that you're going to have to put all that stuff back in 6 months or a year when the political winds shift in the other direction. So
Yeah.
better to know your values beforehand and stick to them. Eric, anything to add to that?
No, I agree. You also should, companies should have uh, policies in place. Most companies have policies in place about when to respond, how to respond, value statements, and they need to stick to their values. And they're easy to guide on when to respond. This is not again, I use the word over and over again. It's not rocket science, but some of it is a feel on when to respond.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it's the height of football season, so I will say you don't send your team out onto the field and only then begin making up the plays.
Right.
For a lot of companies and organizations, that's what happens, whether it has to do with the Trump administration or anything else. I have
But
one more
I
question.
would
Go
say
ahead.
though, you can't wait. You have to be decisive about it.
Yeah.
This is not a let's wait 48, 72 hours. If something happens, you have to act or not act.
Well, and you also have a structure. You also have to have a structure in place to
That's right.
act. I can't tell you how many times even getting the first conference call together to discuss a crisis takes several hours or
It's
even end
ridiculous.
of day, and it can be very problematic. I'm going to throw one other question at you. The election highlighted the growing impact of social media and podcasts, and we've talked here about TikTok and other things in other venues, not today on this program. And the shrinking impact of traditional media. How should we all be thinking of getting the balance right and being prepared to use different distribution tools during a crisis? It's a good question. Eric, why don't you go first on this one?
No, I think that companies ought to be thinking about their own distribution method. I don't rely upon traditional media to get my message out. If I worried about utilizing paid earned media, traditional newspaper, radio, television to carry my message for my clients, I don't think I'd be effective. So for my clients, I think about how they distribute their message. So is it through, depending on the client, I'm thinking of a client now, is it through email blast to specific list? Is it through social media blast through multiple channels? Because there are multiple social media from X to TikTok to Facebook post to posting onto their website to putting it onto a newswire. And then perhaps it gets picked up by the mainstream media. The mainstream media, oftentimes for me, is the last place I'm thinking that it might get picked up. So my distribution channels for my message are multiple, but I'm not relying upon the media to tell my story.
Tom, thoughts on that?
I mean, I totally agree with that, but two things I would say is one, remember a lot of what goes on social media is sharing articles from mainstream media, right? So, I mean, this is what's destroying the whole business model, right? So there's that to consider. But also, I would say, I mean, we generally feel that you respond if a crisis is a social media crisis or arises in a certain medium, you respond in that medium, right? So
Right.
if it's a Twitter, if it's a tweet, you respond on Twitter.
Right, right. And I would echo that point. And I'm going to bring you both together on that point, actually, and echo something that Lucy's been trafficking all the questions and the various things in this webinar. But as I said, she's a very skilled practitioner of this work too. And we were discussing yesterday the fact that even TikTok they may not get it right, but somewhere along the way they began with something somebody saw or read. Now, to Eric's point, that doesn't mean the original thing they saw or read was in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
It could have been on PR Newswire. It could have been on a blog. It could have been in another social media post. And it all comes back to something someone, I'm going to use in the broadest sense, reported on somewhere. And
Right.
now what has happened, and the trouble, as you mentioned, Tom, with the failing lamestream media or whatever you want to call it, is that they no longer control that message, or even as opposed to 10 years ago, they're not the first. 10 years ago, if you looked at Twitter, everything came from an Associated Press or New York Times or Wall Street Journal story. That still happens. But in addition to the broad range of other media, you also have individuals who are also making their voices heard. And again, I started off by saying this presentation is not about chatbots and celebrity smear jobs, but there is also a fair amount of actors outside of people who want to convey news. They just want to cause trouble out there putting information out.
Right,
And
but I'd
these,
also say that, a fair number of companies also use tools to help make sure that news gets shared. Um,
right.
for example, and it's not a sales pitch, but a company that we both use, a company called 5Block. So, for example, if there's a story we want to make sure gets used, we might have it posted on a company's website, but make sure that it gets socialized using a company called 5Blocks. Make sure that when people search for news, that story comes up. And there are this isn't black hat. This is legitimate ways to make sure that when people search for news or articles, that it organically comes up higher, legitimately higher. And so there are tools and mechanisms that companies use to make sure that their stories show up on social media sites in a higher way, because that's the way people find news nowadays. They're not often going to the New York Times or Vanity Fair. They're using social media. And
Yeah,
so
and that
there's a
and
lot
yeah,
of ways to do that, legitimate ways to do it, that we just recognize that's how the world's moving.
and that gets back to the concept of the credibility bank, which is we tell
Right.
clients that whenever there is a problem, the first thing everyone does is they go out and Google the
That's right.
company or organization to see what they can find out about it. If the search results just show, bad news, bad news, bad news, people are going to react in a certain way. If you've built your balance in the credibility bank and inoculated against potential negatives, including from the new administration, that allows you to control and frame the narrative in the largest sense across all platforms, whether it's traditional media, social media, or what have you.
Right.
And again, there's nothing spin doctory or black magic-y about it. It's
That's
about
right.
facts and truth. And it's the same thing that if I have a great idea and I open the door to my office and shout it, only a handful of people are going to hear it.
Right.
That same great idea, if I want to get out there in social media in the right way, I'm going to use the techniques to do so to have the best impact.
That's
We're
right.
about to wind up. I want to remind everyone that we'll be sending around to all registrants a website for Reputation Advisors International that has all of the background materials we've covered during the course of this webinar. You'll also find contact information if you have any follow-up questions. We hope this was helpful and effective, and we hope to make this a first in a series, because as these issues become more and more global, a group like Reputation Advisors International becomes more and more important in discussing them. And perhaps our next webinar will have a representative from Greenland join us. Okay, but
Greenland or the United States of Greenland.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
yeah.
And so thank you all very much, and we appreciate your time here today. And thank you, panelists, as well, for all the work you did, particularly Lucy, who doesn't get to opine like the rest of us, but did all the hard work.
Mhm.
Thank you.